One of the first metals that was ever used by man was lead. Lead was also the cause of the first recorded occupational disease, lead colic, suffered by a metal worker who lived about 2,400 years ago. But while it has many uses, lead is also toxic, poisonous to humans, animals, and plants. When it is taken into the human body, it usually leads to serious health problems, and it can be fatal. According to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, more than 800,000 workers in the United States are exposed to lead regularly as part of their jobs. That's why the agency has issued safety standards designed to protect those workers from lead's harmful effects. In this program, we'll discuss the hazards of on-the-job lead exposure and how the OSHA lead standard helps to protect you from these hazards. Today, the most common way people are exposed to lead is when they breathe in dust and fumes that contain lead while they are at work. When lead is inhaled, it passes through the lungs into the bloodstream and collects in your bones and tissue. Lead dust can be accidentally swallowed as well. Either way, once it has been absorbed by the body, lead can remain there for years and cause serious problems. Lead exposure falls into two basic categories: long-term and acute. In long-term exposure, small amounts of lead accumulate in the body over a long period of time. Long-term exposure can cause damage to your brain and nervous system, as well as your blood, kidneys, and reproductive system. Symptoms of long-term lead exposure include headaches, joint and muscle pain, elevated blood pressure, nausea, dizziness, a metallic taste in the mouth, a loss of appetite, fatigue, and constipation. Acute lead exposure occurs when a large amount of lead is absorbed in a short period of time. Symptoms of acute exposure include drowsiness, memory loss, tremors, vomiting, and severe abdominal pain. It can also produce a brain condition called encephalopathy, which can cause convulsions, coma, and death, all in a matter of days. Although acute exposures to deadly amounts of lead are highly unusual these days, they are not impossible. But the most common type of lead exposure in general industry is long-term. And federal laws are now on the books that protect you by limiting this type of exposure. Chances are you're viewing this program because your job involves some risk of exposure to lead. This risk is associated with many types of activities, including the manufacturing and recycling of lead-acid batteries, sanding and stripping lead-based paint, repairing and servicing automobile brakes, welding or cutting old painted metal, manufacturing ceramics or electronics, and the smelting, refining, alloying, and casting of metals. To protect workers from the harmful health effects of these types of lead exposures, OSHA issued its lead standard, 29 CFR 1910.1025. This regulation sets limits on how much lead employees are allowed to be exposed to, and it establishes procedures employers must follow in order to reduce lead exposure in the workplace as much as possible. For example, before work can start on any project or process that involves lead, employers are required to develop a written compliance program. The program will describe all activities that could expose employees to lead and the compliance methods the employer will use to control that exposure. There are three general types of compliance methods: administrative controls, engineering controls, and personal protective equipment. Administrative controls include policies and procedures such as safe work practices for housekeeping and decontamination, employee training, and medical surveillance and removal programs. Engineering controls include physical and mechanical safeguards such as isolation and containment of a lead hazard area, mechanical ventilation with appropriate filters, and special vacuums for cleanup and decontamination. The third type of compliance method Personal protective equipment is anything you wear to protect yourself when administrative and engineering controls alone can't reduce your lead exposure to acceptable levels. This might include overalls, respirators, gloves, hats, goggles, and face shields, whatever is appropriate for the job you are doing. Another key part of the compliance program is employee training. This will be provided before you start on any job that involves exposure to lead. The training will include information about the health hazards associated with lead exposure, the requirements in the OSHA lead standard, and the contents of your employer's compliance program. You will also learn how to properly use and maintain any PPE that you'll need to wear on the job. Your employer will make any of this information available to you upon request as well. Before you begin a new task that could expose you to lead, your employer is required to find out just how much lead exposure the job will involve. The OSHA standard sets a threshold exposure limit, called the action level, at 30 micrograms of lead per cubic meter of air over an 8-hour period. But the action level's technical details aren't as important as understanding how this benchmark is used in situations where you could be exposed to lead. If your employer's initial determination testing shows that airborne lead is below the action level, then no action is required. Work may proceed without exposure controls, but new tests must be conducted if there are any changes in equipment, processes, or personnel that might also cause a change in the airborne lead level. However, if the initial determination shows potential lead exposure is at or above the action level, your employer must do several other things. More detailed testing will be conducted to determine the lead exposure levels for each specific job classification in the work area. You will be informed regarding which specific work activities could expose you to lead, and you will immediately receive the lead safety training that we discussed earlier. The action level is also used as a benchmark in the medical surveillance and removal programs that are included in the compliance plan, which we'll discuss later. The OSHA standard also sets a maximum daily limit for worker exposure to lead, 50 micrograms of lead per cubic meter of air over an 8-hour shift. This is called the permissible exposure limit, or PEL. If testing shows that the level of airborne lead is below the PEL, then employees are not required to use personal protective equipment. However, some employers may want their workers to wear PPE anyway for maximum protection. If the level of airborne lead in the workplace exceeds the PEL, then your employer must use whatever exposure controls are necessary to reduce it to below the limit. You will be informed as to the steps they are taking. Additionally, air monitoring must be done to track your potential lead exposure on an ongoing basis, and your employer must inform you in writing of all the monitoring results. Employers must keep records of all other air monitoring results as well, and make them available to you to review if you like. If you will be working in areas where the airborne lead concentration is above the permissible exposure limit, PEL, your employer must provide you with appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, to reduce your exposure to acceptable levels. This equipment must be provided to you at no cost. Your employer is responsible for keeping it clean and functional, and for disposing of it properly when necessary. Since respirators are key to preventing you from inhaling airborne lead, your compliance plan includes a respiratory protection program. This program requires that you be given a suitable respirator in several types of situations, including while engineering controls are being set up but are not working yet, whenever administrative and engineering controls aren't able to reduce lead exposure to below the PEL, or whenever you ask for one. The respirator protection program also requires that you receive any training that you need in order to use your respirator correctly. The training will include the proper use and maintenance of the respirator, what type of filter cartridges to use, and when and how to replace the cartridges. But no respirator can promise you full protection unless it has been fit tested. The seal that the respirator makes against your face must be tight. A fit test will make sure no lead dust can leak into where you can breathe it. If you have any trouble breathing through your respirator during a fit test, a medical examination will be scheduled to make sure you can wear one safely. If you ever have doubts about whether your respirator fits you or is working correctly, check with your supervisor before you enter a lead hazard area. The administrative controls that protect you from lead exposure include standard operating procedures, SOPs, guidelines for what you can do to reduce lead hazards. Your employer's compliance program will address using these work practice controls in two particular areas: housekeeping and decontamination. Housekeeping encompasses the cleanup and disposal of lead-contaminated materials. Its goal is to keep work surfaces free from the buildup of lead dust or other lead residue. Never use compressed air for this. Blasting these substances away will only create more problems by mixing them into the air. Instead, you need to use a vacuum cleaner equipped with a high-efficiency particulate air HEPA filter that will capture the lead contaminants safely. Once they've been caught, you should empty the vacuum cleaner carefully so you don't spread contaminants back into the work area. Since cleaning methods like shoveling, sweeping, and brushing are much more likely to stir up lead dust, you should only use them when vacuuming is either impossible or impractical. And remember, you should never eat, drink, smoke, or apply cosmetics when you're inside an area that is contaminated with lead. All of these activities can transfer contaminants into your body. Decontamination procedures focus on preventing you from spreading lead to outside the hazard area via your equipment, clothes, or body. When you break for lunch or stop at the end of the day, you need to clean any lead contamination off of your protective clothing and equipment. This should be done in a climate-controlled changing room or decontamination chamber, which is set up for that purpose. Never clean off by blowing, shaking, brushing, or doing anything else that will disperse contaminants into the air. Instead, clean off safely with a HEPA vacuum. When you are working in lead exposure situations, your employer will also have set up a climate-controlled lunchroom or eating area. It is critical that you decontaminate your work clothing and equipment before you enter these clean zones. Thoroughly wash your hands and face as well. Since you will be in a space where you or your coworkers will be eating and drinking, and possibly smoking or applying cosmetics, these precautions reduce the risk of anyone accidentally swallowing any lead contaminants. At the end of your shift, you should go through the normal decontamination process. Then place your equipment and protective clothing in the appropriate containers for cleaning or disposal. Your employer will provide shower facilities so you can wash up thoroughly before changing back into your street clothes. Separate clothing storage lockers in the changing room will prevent any cross-contamination of lead between your PPE and your street clothes. Remember, decontamination also prevents you from bringing any lead contamination home to your friends and loved ones. So it's important to be thorough. Even when your employer's exposure controls are keeping on-the-job lead exposure to below the permissible exposure limit, you may still receive a low level of lead exposure, especially if lead is present above the action level. That's why OSHA's lead standard requires employers to establish a medical surveillance program for all employees who are exposed at or above the action level for more than 30 days per year. The program provides free blood tests and medical examinations on an ongoing basis to monitor your lead exposure and its effect on your health. First, blood samples will be taken to determine your blood lead level, BLL, and zinc protoporphyrin, ZPP level. These will show how much lead exposure, if any, you've already had. They also establish a baseline for later readings and help to determine what your schedule should be for future blood tests and medical exams. The higher your BLL and ZPP, the more often you'll need to be tested to make sure you're staying within safe limits. You will be informed in writing of all your test results. The periodic medical examinations you receive as part of the surveillance program will include a thorough physical evaluation. The doctor will watch for any changes that indicate you have been overexposed to lead. If you wear a respirator at work, your heart and lung functioning will also be monitored to make sure the PPE is not overstressing them. In addition to your periodic examinations, you will be scheduled for an exam immediately anytime you show symptoms of lead exposure. If your medical exams show that you have too much lead in your blood, or your health starts to be affected, you will need to undergo temporary medical removal. This means that you are temporarily not permitted to work in areas with airborne lead concentrations above the action level. Instead, your employer will move you to another work area or send you home with pay. The purpose of this temporary removal is to allow time for the amount of lead in your body to fall to a safe level. During your removal, you will receive medical removal protection benefits. Under this program, your employer is required to maintain your wages, benefits, job status, and seniority, just as though you had not been removed. Your employer must also keep records of all your medical surveillance and removal information and make it available to you whenever you request it. We've seen that while lead exposure can pose a real health risk, by adhering to the requirements in the OSHA lead standard, your employer can help to keep you safe. The rest is up to you. Let's review. Before work begins on any project or process that involves possible exposure to lead, your employer is required to develop a written compliance program. This program will include the use of administrative and engineering controls, as well as personal protective equipment if it is needed. The program will also contain information about the safe work practices that should be used in areas where lead exposure could occur, including housekeeping and decontamination procedures. If there is the potential for you to be exposed to lead, your employer will provide the training, equipment, and PPE you need to work safely. If your blood lead level, BLL, gets too high, or your health starts to be affected by lead contamination, you will be temporarily removed from any work that exposes you to lead. During any temporary removal, your pay and other job benefits will be protected while the lead works its way out of your system. OSHA has set limits and established rules to help keep you safe from lead exposure on the job. Now that you know the hazards that are associated with lead contamination and understand how to avoid them, you can get your job done and go home safe every day.